for today's discussion, we are going to talk about origin of species. Okay, so yan, it's always related to Darwin, yung natural selection niya, okay, about origin of species. Anyway, this will be very quick kasi by 3 magkakaroon ako ng webinar. So inform me 30 minutes before the time if ever umabot man tayo doon. Okay po? So, yan. So, origin of species. Can I continue or can I proceed? Nakikita niyo yung presentation and you're hearing my voice clearly?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so yeah.
Yes, po.
Okay, so here we're going to encounter words like speciation. Okay, so I said it already last time that speciation is a change in a species resulting to the formation of another species. Okay po? So the origin of new species is at the focal point of Darwin's evolutionary theory. Okay, so from the previous. So evolutionary theory must explain how new species originate and how populations evolve. Okay, so how do speciation happens and how do evolution of population happens. Okay po? Happen. So microevolution, we know that evolutions are categorized into two, microevolution and macroevolution. Okay, so microevolution consists of adaptation that evolve within a population. Okay, within the population meaning it's under the species level. Okay, it's confined to just one gene pool, meaning a gene pool of a particular population. Okay, and that is for microevolution. Anyway, I already discussed this microevolution in chapter 23. Okay, so you need to also review this one. So on the other hand, we have macroevolution, which refers to the evolutionary change above the species level. Okay, so yan, very general yung kanilang definition, but I hope later on we can distinguish. Okay, so yeah, so this one is an example of an organism that evolved. Okay, so biologists compare morphology, physiology. Pag sinabing morphology, it's more of anatomy, it's more of structural component of a particular organism. Physiology, function, how parts of an organism function. Okay, next, biochemistry. Okay, so next and the most useful comparison, we have DNA sequences. Okay, so in grouping what do you call this? In grouping organisms in a phylogeny or phylogenetic tree, so we need to use this kind of data, morphology, physiology, biochemistry, and DNA sequences for us to prove that a particular organism is closely related to one another. Okay po? So yan, pero yung pinaka last resort dyan, yung parang kumbaga final judgment dyan is the DNA sequences. Kasi yun. So the biological species concept states that a species is a group of population. Alam nyo na to, di ba? What is species and what is population? Anyway, for the sake of this discussion, I'm going to repeat it. Okay, so a group of population whose members have the potential to interbreed, okay, in nature and produce viable or fertile offspring. So they do not breed successfully with other population. So even though they breed successfully, there are problems along the way. Okay, so later on, we're going to identify what are the restrictions or what hampers successful reproduction. Okay po? So, yan. So, that's species. Okay? So, the species concept focuses more on sexually reproducing organisms. Okay? Sexually reproducing organisms which contains gametes. Okay? The use of egg and sperm. However, the concept of species in asexual reproducing organisms like bacteria, like plants, are somewhat complex. Okay? But for this time, ang focus naman muna natin is for sexually producing. Okay? Or sexually reproducing. So, yan. So, remember the definition of a species, okay, and a population. When we speak of population, can anyone define what population is? Sige nga po. Can you please define in your own wordings kung ano yung population? How do you understand the concept of population?
Sir,
Oh, sige nga. Can I hear from you, Lorian?
sir, yung population po, sir, yun po yung group of parang individual na magkaparehas or same species po sila.
Okay, very good. Okay, so in a given area. Okay, area or habitat. Okay, so very good for that, Lorian. So let's proceed. Okay, so here you can see A and B. Okay, A presents similarity between different species. They are actually different species but they possess similarities. Okay po? For letter B, it's for human, the diversity within species. See? So, even though there are organisms which are different, okay, or species different, we can see or we can observe some similarities. But to some extent, like human, we can see diversity, like white, black, curl, straight, etc. Okay? So, yan. So, in earlier discussion, so we've talked about gene flow. Okay, when we speak of gene flow, that pertains to immigration and emigration, which resulted to reduced genetic variation. Okay, kasi meron nga silang transfer of allele frequency. Okay, so yan. So here, we are going also to talk reproductive isolation. When we speak of reproductive isolation, that's the barrier of interbreeding. Okay, so reproductive isolation is the existence of biological factors, or you call this as barriers, that impede two different species from producing what? Producing viable, fertile offspring. Okay? If the offspring is not viable, that means, hindi siya successfully under species. And if it's not also fertile. Okay? So, hybrids are the offspring of crosses between different species. Diba? It's more common to plants. Mga hybrid plants, also with the dogs, hybrids, meaning it's a crosses between different species. Okay, so reproductive isolation can be classified by weather factors. Sorry, wait class. Okay, so yan. So reproductive isolation can be classified by whether factors act before or after fertilization. Even though it's successful in fertilizing the egg, okay, reproductive isolation can still exist when, for example, number one, the offspring is not viable. Eventually, it dies because hindi nga siya viable in an environment. Two is that when the offspring is not fertile, incapable of reproducing. Okay, so next. Okay, so yan. So since sabi ko nga kanina, so factors affect before or after fertilization. Now, we can classify or we can categorize reproductive isolation into two. We have pre-zygotic barrier, meaning it will not allow to fertilize the egg or it blocks fertilization from occurring. In what ways? Number one, impeding different species from attempting to mate. So, mating or sexual intercourse pa lang, it impedes or the barriers impedes different species. Second, preventing the successful completion of mating. Even though they mate or even though they met, for example, they prevent or these barriers prevent the successful completing of mating or parang hindi talaga successful. Okay? Third, hindering fertilization if mating is successful. For example, nakapag-release siya ng egg and sperm, however, this barrier hinders fertilization after, for example, mating. Okay? So that's for pre-zygotic. So pre-zygotic barriers maintain reproductive isolation and include, what are these? So temporal, okay, habitat, behavioral, mechanical, gamete isolation. We have 4 under pre-zygotic. So let's talk about that one by one. Okay po? So let's talk first about pre-zygotic, which habitat. Habitat isolations mean, kung makikita niyo itong illustration class, yung blue are of different species. Yung coding na blue and yung blue and yellow, they are of different species. Okay? Yung isa nasa baba, yung isa nasa taas. And this one here represents parang no. Okay? Parang hindi siya nag-produce ng offspring, for example. Etong green one dito, it produces an offspring kasi it's a post-zygotic barrier. However, these are the concerns. There are reduced hybrid viability, reduced hybrid fertility, hybrid breakdown. Okay? So meron yung mga no's. Okay? And if these are not met, okay, yung mga no's na yan, so you will produce a viable fertile offspring. Okay? So let's talk first about habitat isolation. When one species are isolated in habitat, for example, one of the habitat is aquatic and the other is terrestrial. So hindi talaga sila, okay? Hindi talaga sila wala talaga silang chance mag-mate. Okay? So you call this class as habitat isolation. In the case of this one, the water-dwelling thamnophis and the terrestrial thamnophis. Okay? So they are habitat isolated. Okay? So habitat isolations, two species encounter each other rarely or not at all because they occupy different habitats even though not isolated by physical barriers. Halimbawa, yung katabi ng aquatic resource na tinitirhan nitong organism na to is katabi lang nito. Okay? However, since they live in different habitats, they don't meet, or if they met, very occasional lang. Okay? Or very seldom. Okay po? So that's habitat isolation. For temporal isolation, species that breed at different times of the day, meaning one breeds different times of the day, not only day, for seasons as well, or years, and therefore cannot mix their gametes. For example, one of the species breed at summer season, the other species breed at winter season. So yan. So the other breed, one breeds during a day, the other breeds during night. Okay, so yan. So temporal isolation, meaning time matters here. Okay. So second thing, behavioral isolation, like courtship rituals and other behaviors unique to a species are effective barriers. Okay? So rituals are performed, kaya nga siya behavior. Okay? So next, we have mechanical isolation. Mechanical isolation, it's because of their morphological differences. because of these differences that prevents them to have a successful mating. Even though they mate at one point, however, they couldn't do the mating or the copulation because of their morphological differences. Okay? So, yan. So, next, we have gametic isolation. A sperm of one species may not be able to fertilize egg of another species. Okay? They mate successfully, they copulate, the male releases the sperm, the female releases the egg. However, the sperm and egg itself cannot fuse. Okay, so the sperm cannot successfully fertilize the egg. Okay, so next. Okay, so here is an example of behavioral isolation as an occurrence of mating rituals. Okay, for blue-footed boobies. Okay, so this one is an example of mechanical isolation that works in a way that their shells are spiraling in opposite direction. Okay, so therefore, hindi sila makapag-mate successfully. Okay? But if they are in the same direction, so they could mate successfully. Okay? So, that's with Bradybana. Okay? So, next. Okay, after, pakita ko muna sa inyo yung ano. Yan. So, habitat, temporal, and behavioral. So, yan. So, hindi sila magkaroon ng mating attempt. Yung habitat, walang attempt, mating attempt. Yung behavioral, walang attempt. Nagkaroon man sila ng mating attempt here. So, the problem is they are mechanically isolated because of morphological differences. They are also gametic isolated, meaning the sperm cannot fertilize the egg. Okay, so yan. Even though nagkaroon sila ng attempt. Or, in some cases, nagkaroon naman ng fertilization na nakapag-produce ng offspring. However, the produced offspring has reduced hybrid viability. This is for postzygotic. After fertilization, postzygotic. Reduced hybrid fertility and hybrid breakdown. Okay, so let's continue. Okay, so prevent the hybrid zygote from developing into a viable. Ano ba yung ibig sabihin ng viable? Okay, so when we speak of viable, it can survive itself into the environment. Okay, fertile meaning it can also reproduce. Okay, by itself, together with other species. Okay po? So, as a result of what? Reduced hybrid viability, meaning weak offspring, madaling mamatay, for example. So, sakitin, for example. Reduced hybrid fertility, sterile. Okay? Pag sinabing sterile, incapable of reproducing. And hybrid breakdown. So, this one is a mule. Okay? Mule is a hybrid of a donkey and a horse. Okay? It is an example of postzygotic. Okay? Postzygotic barrier. Why? The horse and the donkey successfully mated and produced offspring. However, the offspring is not sterile, or the offspring is sterile or incapable of reproducing. So that's one example of postzygotic barrier. Okay, so other definition of species, kasi sabi ko nga yung concept of species is very critical in understanding all the processes in organisms. Okay? So the biological concepts cannot be applied to fossils. Cannot be applied to fossils. Concept of fossils or asexual organisms. So ito na yung sinasabi ko, especially for prokaryotes, like because they are asexually reproducing like budding, di ba? Yung budding, fragmenting, yun, they are not using sperm and egg to reproduce, okay? So, yan. Hindi siya ma-apply yung species, biological concept of species. So, other species concept emphasize the unity within a species rather than separateness of different species. Unity rather than separateness. So, the morphological species concept defines a species by structural features. Sometimes, they classify species, okay, based on morphological or structural features, okay? If these are the same, they are probably more likely to be under the same species. Okay? It applies to sexual and asexual species but relies on subjective criteria. Halimbawa, yung kaninang bird na pinakita ko sa inyo, diba kasi pag in-apply mo yung morphological species, ito magkamukha. Parehas ng pakpak, parehas ng color ng feather. So, pwede mong sabihin na sila ay under the same species. Sabi ko nga, nakarely lang siya sa subjective area. Pakita ko yung kaninang pinakita ko. Ito, yung letter A. So, they are different species. But if you are going to judge these two organisms, you are more likely to, what do you call this? You are more likely to state that these two organisms are under the same species, di ba? Okay? So, kaya nakarely lang siya. Subjective, ano lang siya? Subjective, anong tawag dito? Subjective lang yung kanyang, or observation. Okay? So, yan. Kaya the concept of species is very crucial. Okay, so, ito yung kanina, morphological species concept. Yung ecological species concept naman views a species in terms of its ecological niche. Meaning, ano yung kinakain, saan nakatira, ano yung behavior, so that composes the ecological niche. Okay? So, yun yung view under ecology or ecological concept of species. It applies to sexual and asexual species and emphasizes the role of disruptive selection. So earlier in the chapter 23, when we speak of disruptive selection, that's the mode of natural selection. So we have three. We have directional selection, we have disruptive selection. Okay, tatlo yan. So, i-review nyo na lang later. Okay? So, the phylogenetic species concept defines a species as a smallest group of individuals on a phylogenetic tree. So, magkakaiba. Iba-ibang concept ang species depende kung anong field or ano yung preference. Okay? So, here, it applies to sexual and asexual, but it can be difficult to determine the degree of difference required to separate species. So, yun yung meron siyang pros, meron din siyang cons. Okay? So, yan. So, there are different definition of species class, ha? Remember, the different definition of species depende kung ano yung concept. Okay? Meron tayong biological. Okay, pag sinabing biological, yun yung it can produce viable and fertile offspring. We have morphological. So, kasi yung cons nung biological species concept is that it only applies to sexual species. Sa asexual species, hindi siya nag-a-apply. Yung morphological naman, ang pros niya, nag-a-apply siya sa sexual and asexual, pero yun, ang cons naman niya, subjective. Okay, so subjective yung criteria. Depende siya sa observation ng tao. Okay, that's morphological concept. For ecological concept, okay, so it applies to both sexual and asexual, and emphasizes the role of disruptive selection. Why? Because ang tinitingnan niya dito is the niche. Okay? And niche is very important to species because niche pertains to not only to habitat where they live in, ano ba yung behavior, ano ba yung needs, ano yung kailangan. So, yan. So, if they are the same, they are ecologically the same when it comes to niche. So, therefore, they are of the same species. Okay? For phylogenetic, again, it applies to sexual and asexual, but the problem is the degree of difference in their structure. Okay? So, yan. Very complex. Anyway, speciation can occur in two ways. Okay? So, number one, we have allopatric speciation. Allopatric, it's one species, or speciation occurred as a result of a geographic barrier. Okay? Meron siyang geographic barrier. For example, one that comes from an island and one that comes from a mainland. They are all terrestrial but they are geographically separated. Okay? Ano yung nag-separate sa kanila? It's the bodies of water. Okay po? So, for sympatric, no geographic barrier. So, here, presenting you two types of speciation. Okay, this one is the original population. Allopatric speciation, there is a barrier, di ba? There's a land between two bodies of water. So, yan. So, since there is a barrier that separates one population to the other, more likely the other will have to produce another species, or you call that as a speciation. Okay? So, for sympatric speciation, this one is a bit more complex than this. It also happens, even though they live in the same area, they have the same ecological niche. Sympatric speciation also still happens because of some sort of mutation, okay, and etc. Okay, so in allopatric speciation, gene flow is interrupted. There is no gene flow. When we speak of gene flow, transfer of one species to the one species from one population to another population. Okay? So, walang gene flow. So, or you call that as macroevolution. Okay? So, yan. So, N is cumulative effect of many speciation and extinction event. Okay? So, yan. Halimbawa, genetic drift. Okay? Alam niyo yung genetic drift? Yung Continental drift theory ni Alfred Wegener. So, are you familiar with that? So, that's one example of allopatric speciation. Okay? So, again, reduced when a population is divided into geographically isolated subpopulations. So, yan. It separates the two populations by having geographic barrier. Okay, geographic barrier can be any form. It can be island, it can be a mountain, it can be water. Okay, it can be just, for example, wall. Okay, yun yung mga example ng barriers. Okay, so separate populations may evolve independently through mutation kasi we know that mutation happens all the time. Natural selection because they probably could have different environment, okay, and genetic drift. Okay, so reproductive isolation between populations generally increases as the distance between them increases. For example, the distance, if you look at the globe, you know that globe is separated by latitude and longitude. Okay, let's say latitude. At the lower latitudes, we have warmer temperature. Okay, temperature greatly affects the speciation of organisms. Okay, and at higher latitudes, we have lower temperature or cold temperatures. So that's one example of speciation that as the distance between them increases, their speciation also increases. Okay pa? So, barriers to reproduction are intrinsic. Okay? Separation itself is not a biological barrier. Okay, so yan, barriers to reproductions are intrinsic, meaning panloob. That separation itself is not a biological barrier. Okay, so let's proceed. So this one shows you allopatric speciation of this one, two species, Leocurus and Harisi. Ano yung nagse-separate sa kanila? Okay, so that's the anong tawag ito? Ridge.
Canyon.
Okay, canyon. Okay, so very good. Okay, so that's one example of allopatric speciation. Okay, so here, the continental drift caused allopatric speciation. Ito yung sabi ko na the drifting of land masses over the globe. Okay po? So here, in this case, you will see the graph presenting million years ago. So 100 million years ago is the most recent, itong 0. Okay? So kung makikita nyo, at 88 million years ago, that's the point here. Okay? So ganyan yung itsura ng continent. Okay? That's the India, the blue one, and the red one is the Madagascar. Okay? So at first, they are closely connected. They are connected. Very close sila. Tapos, after series of years, 65 million years ago, so ganyan na yung itsura niya. And 56, masyado na siyang malayo kasi yung direction niya papalayo ng India. Okay, so, along with this, so, ito na yung mga speciation na nangyayari. Okay? So, we have Mantelinae. So, we have for Madagascar only. We have Rhacoporinae, so India and Southeast Asia. So, ganyan po. And we have other Indian Southeast Asian frogs. Okay, so ganyan. So, allopatric speciation as caused by continental drift. Okay, so in Sympatric naman, okay, so speciation takes place in geographically overlapping population, meaning populations that overlap in the same area. Okay? Polyploidy is the presence of extra sets of chromosomes due to accidents during cell division, di ba? When during during gamete formation or during meiosis, when the cell failed to separate completely into two, kasi di ba during anaphase dapat maghiwalay yung homologous chromosomes. Pag hindi yung naghiwalay yung homologous chromosomes, the tendency is that you will form a polyploidy. Meaning, yung maa-assign na halimbawa, 46. Sa tao na lang, for example. Pero hindi naman siya nag-a-apply. For example, sa tao, we have 46. Okay? We have two sets of chromosomes. During gamete formation, it should separate. The 46 should separate into two. Okay? During meiosis pala, magduduplicate muna siya. Okay? Magduduplicate yung sister chromatids. Then, it will separate. The homologous chromosomes will separate during anaphase 1. When that happens, yun. Since dalawang series ng cell division, ang end goal dapat is 23. Okay, kada isang 23 chromosomes kada isang gamete. Pero pag nag-fail yun na mag-separate, so meaning ang ma-assign sa isang sperm, for example, nag-fail is 46. Hindi siya nag-separate completely. So pag yung 46 na yon nag-knit siya or nag-fertilize siya sa, for example, yung 46 is the sperm, and yung egg is 23, nag-fertilize sila, meaning, meron ng extra set. Instead of 2 sets na 46, nagkaroon na sila ng 3 sets. Okay po? So, 46 plus 23, ilan ba? Okay, so, yan. Basta yon 3 sets na. Okay? So, an autopolyploid is an individual with more than 2 chromosome sets. Okay? More than 2 chromosome sets derived from one species. Pag Allopolyploid is a species with multiple sets of chromosomes derived from different species. Okay, derived from different species. So, halimbawa, same species, parehas tao, for example lang ha, pero hindi siya, same species, parehas tao, nagkaroon siya ng failure pagdating sa cell division, and there happens a polyploid, ang tawag doon class, autopolyploid. But when different species come in contact, tapos nag-mate or nag-produce ng offspring, ang tawag na doon class is allopolyploid. Okay, allo, it is separated by different species. Auto, it is within the same species. Okay po. So, polyploidy is common in plants. Okay, so very common siya sa plants pero hindi sa animals. Many important crops like oats, cotton, potatoes, tobacco, and wheat are polyploids. So, yan. Pero hindi naman natin siya, hindi naman siya problem when it comes to plants. So, ito, polyploidy is common in plants. So, kung makikita nyo, the normal number is of a diploid cell, for example, is 2n, kaya nga siya diploid, is equals to 6. During cell division, okay, it failed to separate. So, since kailangan niya ng 2, 3, and 3, so, instead of that, naging 4n na siya. Okay? 4n since it doubles. Naging 12. Okay? So, yan. Gametes produced are diploid. Okay? So, 2n, diploid. Offspring with tetraploid karyotypes may be viable and fertile. So, that's for tetraploid. Okay? So, here, Sympatric speciation from polyploidy, okay, as means of alloploid. Okay, so here species A, species B. Okay, remember that alloploid comes from different species, di ba? Kung makikita nyo, ang normal nito is 4, ang normal nito is 6. Kaya siya alloploid. Pero pag autoploid, wala kasi. Basta pag autoploid, parehas sila, parehas. Okay, so here, during meiosis, it has an error. It was supposed to divide but failed. Okay, ito naman normal. Okay, kasi from 6 naging 3. Ito from 4, still 4 kaya hindi sila nag-divide. Okay? When that fused, okay, so 3 and 4, so ito yung magiging result. Hybrid with chromosome 7 or 7 chromosomes kasi 4 plus 3 we have 7. Okay? So, yan, nag-fuse sila. So, unreduced gamete with 7 chromosomes. Okay? So, yung offspring na to, okay? Anong tawag dito? So, yung offspring na to, eto na. Okay? So, from species A, so, nagkaroon siya ng another gamete, which is 3. Okay, when that happens, it becomes viable. Kapag tetraploid. Okay po? So, kasi ito, plus 3. Okay? So, nagiging 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Maging 5 sets na siya. Okay? That completes the being a polyploid. Okay po? So, yan. 2n is equals to 10 then. Okay, so sympatric speciation can result from the appearance of new ecological niches. Though they are of the same area, but it has the new ecological niches, so sympatric speciation occurs. Okay? So, for example, the North American maggot fly can live on native hawthorn trees as well as more recently introduced apple trees. Okay po? So, since merong introduced na apple trees, the tendency is that there are maggot flies that will also adapt to this kind of niche or habitat, for example. Okay? And sympatric speciation can occur. So, sexual selection can drive sympatric speciation. So, sexual selection for mates or different colors has likely contributed to the speciation of cichlid fish in Lake Victoria. That's an example. Okay? So, next, allopatric speciation, geographic separation, restricts gene flow between population. So, yun yung ano natin, yun yung tatandaan natin. So, reproductive isolation may then arise by natural selection, genetic drift, and sexual selection in the isolated population. So, reproductive can be pre-zygotic, post-zygotic. Okay? So, even if contact is restored between populations, interbreeding is prevented. Ito na yung sinabi ko kanina na tatlong cases. Pwedeng yung dalawang different species hindi man lang magkita or bihirang magkita, or second, nagkita man sila pero hindi successful yung yung pag-mate, hindi nakapag-fertilize. Third is nagkita sila, naging successful yung kanilang mate, copulation, nakapag-produce ng offspring, but the offspring is not viable. Okay? And fertile. So, yun yung cases ng reproductive isolation. Okay? So, in sympatric speciation, ano yung nangyayari? Polyploidy. Okay? So, a reproductive barrier isolates a subset of population without geographic separation from the parent species. Okay? So, yan. Also, reproductive barrier occurs in this kind of speciation. Okay, so sympatric speciation can result from polyploidy, natural selection, and sexual selection. So let's talk about hybrid zone. It's the region in which members of different species mate and produce hybrid. Okay, hybrid zone ang tawag. So hybrid zone can occur in a single band where adjacent species mate. Halimbawa, mountain, halimbawa nasa mountain tapos yung isang species naman nasa foot of the mountain. So the tendency is there can be a possibility na sila ay makapag-mate. Okay? A hybrid zone can occur in a single band where adjacent, magkatabi lang yung species. Okay? So hybrids often have reduced fitness. Kaya yung mga mahilig sa hybrid, ito yung kanilang mga problems. Reduced fitness compared with parent species. Especially with dogs. Okay? So, yun yung mga hybrids. Okay, so the distributions of hybrid zones can be more complex if parent species are found in multiple habitats. They can live in upland, they can live in lowland, they can live in near shore, they can live in multiple habitats nga within the same region. Kaya nagkakaroon tayo ng mga hybridization. These are hybrids that are naturally occurring then. Okay? Iba naman kasi yung domesticated hybrids. Okay, so here in this case, okay, hybrid zone. Ito yung hybrid zone. Okay, so around here, fire-bellied toad range. So yan yung ano niya. Tapos yellow-bellied toad range. So since they are adjacent, so in between is the hybrid zone na tinatawag. Okay? You call this as bombina, variegata. Okay? So, di ba? Kung titignan mo siya in different concept of species, so you will arrive at different anong tawag dito? Justification. Pwede mong sabihin na sila ay magkaparehas, sila ay hindi magkaparehas. Okay po? So, yan. So, here is the graph showing you the allele frequency and the distance from hybrid zone center. As the distance from hybrid zone center, what do you call this? Decreases kasi nasa zero, di ba? At 0 point, meaning the distance are very near, okay, allele frequency is maintained. Okay po, having this kind of graph. Okay, so hybrid zones over time, when closely related species meet in hybrid zone, there are 3 possible outcomes. Number 1, reinforcement, strengthening of reproductive barriers, reducing gene flow. We have fusion, weakening of reproductive barriers with eventual fusion into one species, kaya nga siya fusion. Stabilizing continued formation of hybrid individuals. So here are the possible outcomes of hybrid over time. Okay? Can either be reinforcement. Ano nga yung reinforcement? Reducing gene flow. Okay? Fusion, meaning, reducing gene flow, kaya siya nagsiseparate. Okay? Fusion, ganyan yung construction niya kasi it will fuse into one species over time. And stability, ganyan lang siya. Straight line lang siya. Kasi it is continued formation of individuals. Okay? So here in this case, population, 5 individuals are shown. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, yan, nagkaroon ng gene flow. Okay? So, here is the barrier. Okay, may barrier. Meaning, these groups are isolated from this group. Okay, so because of the barrier. So, kung makikita nyo, yan. Ganyan yung kanilang magiging itsura. So, there are differences. But when that barriers are removed, for example, so it will more likely to have gene flow between the two. And this gene flow are considered to happen within the hybrid zone. Okay? Kasi ito yung hybrid zone na to, wala na silang barrier between the two. Okay po? I hope you're getting the illustration. Okay? So, these are now the hybrids. As a result of the mating of two adjacent species that are not separated by barriers like this. Okay? So, yan. Broad patterns in speciation can be studied using the fossil record, morphological data, and molecular data. Fossils, structures, and DNA. Fossil record includes examples of species that appear suddenly, persist essentially unchanged for some time, and then apparently disappear. Okay, so that explains further. Okay, so eto, meron tayong tinatawag na punctuated equilibrium, which was coined by Niles Eldredge and Stephen J. Good, okay, to describe periods of apparent stasis, or when we speak of stasis, no change or stable, okay? Punctuated by brief periods of rapid change. Pag sinabing rapid, biglaan yung pag-change from black to gray, from white to black, for example. So, the punctuated equilibrium models contrast with Darwinian model. Pag sinabing contrast, parang on the contrary. Okay? Na yung kay Darwin kasi gradualism. Meaning, throughout the time, there is gradualism. Parang kumbaga sa colors, merong gradient. From bright, slowly it becomes dark. Something like that. So, slow, continuous change over time in species existence. So, here is the illustration presenting you punctuated equilibrium in contrast to gradualism by Darwin. Okay? So, this is a change over time. So, kung makita nyo, rapid from this particular original species, so, naging ganyan na siya. Okay? Yan. Okay? So, rapid. Nagkaroon ng bigla. Ito naman, gradualism. Paunti-unti hanggang siya maging dito. Okay? Merong gradualism. So, magka-kontra silang dalawa. Okay, so the explosion of genomics is enabling researchers to identify specific genes involved in some cases of speciation. So, depending on the species in question, speciation might require a change of only a single allele. Pwedeng single allele. Halimbawa, yung brown hair, it becomes another color throughout the time kasi single allele siya. Or it can be many alleles. Okay, so not only brown hair, for example. Okay, from speciation to macroevolution. Macroevolution is the cumulative effect of many speciation and extinction events. So that's for macro. Higher level na siya ng evolution. Okay, so here, the same thing, tingnan nyo, for Sympatric and Allopatric. So, for the last slide, so kung makita nyo, this one is an example of a Polyploidy. Okay, these are the ancestral species. the Triticum monococcum, wild Triticum, and wild Triticum toshi. Okay? Okay, so yan. So yan yung kanilang yan yung kanilang chromosomal number. So the product of that, since there is a presence of speciation, okay? Meaning as a result of, for example, in an hybrid zone, etong tatlong to nag-exist in the same area or in the adjacent area. So ito yung kanilang naging product. Since sabi ko nga, polyploidy is very common in plants. Okay? So ito na yung Triticum aestivum. Okay? Or the bread wheat. Okay pa? So 2n is equal to 42. Okay? So yan. So that explains how species originated from the other species. Okay? How speciation occur, in what way, and what are the reproductive barriers that hampers speciation. Okay, so mode of speciation, we've talked all about that here in our discussion. Okay po?